This video has been a while in the making, but I hope you're excited as well, because in this video we will be talking about freezed and using freezed in Riverpod, or more specifically, how freezed enhances Riverpod. In the previous videos, we made this example to-dos app, but just like in those videos, the actual application is not important, the code in this app is not really important, it is just the concepts that we will discuss. So you don't actually need to watch the previous videos. However, this video does assume that you are familiar with the topics covered in the previous 3 videos, especially the third video where we covered async value, as async value is actually generated using freezed. So if you're not familiar with async value, then I definitely suggest you watch the third video in the series. So with that said, let's jump on in and get started with freezed. So what is freezed? If we take a look at the description on pub.dev, you can see that it is yet another code generator for unions, pattern matching, and copy. And we will discuss these 3 things in this video, but we will take a more practical approach. I'm not going to go into all of the nitty-gritty details of freezed, and instead just show you how I practically use it in my everyday programming life. If you want more of a backstory to why freezed exists and why it is so extremely useful, I definitely recommend this video by Riverpod. He takes it slow and goes into detail on a lot of the different features of freezed and why you would want to use them. But that said, taking the practical approach and just dropping it into an app and showing you how it can be useful, I think is also valuable. So instead of me rambling on the different features of freezed, let's go to the code and actually start integrating freezed into our application. First off, we will need to add freezed to the pubsec.yaml file. So this is a dev dependency, so we will just add freezed at the bottom, and you will also see that we are adding build runner. And build runner is necessary because we need to run code generation to generate the code from our freezed classes. For now, that is all we need, so we can save this and just get the latest versions. And now freeze should be good and ready to use. So now what we want to do is I want to show you how we can generate freeze data classes. So in this application, we make use of this to-do model over here. And this to-do model represents the to-do state. So as you can see, we have a description, whether it's completed, and the ID of the to-do. And then within our to-do.state file, we have a state notifier. And this state notifier has an async value with a list of to-dos. And the async value is just used to generate data and error and loading states. What we are talking about now and what we care about is just this to-do class over here. And the first problem that we want to tackle is that when we want to change one field in a to-do that's already been created, so one to-do instance, that requires us to do a lot of manual typing. So let me show you an example of this. In the edit method at the bottom, you can see that when we call the edit method, we pass in an ID, a description, and then we do a for loop within our to-dos, so our state when data to-dos, and then we take a look at the ID of the to-do, and if it's matching, then we pass in this new description and we create this entire new to-do. The problem is that we need to do this for every single parameter. For example, if there were 20 different parameters in this to-do class, we would have needed to do this for all of those parameters. And that is the first nice thing that freeze does for us. Freezed does a copy with automatically. So it adds a copy with method to our freeze classes that allows us to only modify one field in a to-do class. And then it returns an entirely new to-do instance. So let's jump to our to-do file, and we will now create a freezed version of this to-do. So let's comment this out. And this is probably where I'm going to turn you off by showing you how to actually generate this code, because it does look a little bit strange if you're not familiar with it, and it does seem like it's extra work. But let's show what an actual freeze data class looks like. So as you can see, I just used a snippet to create this abstract class called data class. And this is highly recommended, using snippets to automatically generate the code for you. So as you can see, I'm typing f data, and then I have this snippet called f data class that generates this freeze data class. And I will include these snippets and their code within the GitHub repository. So if you want to add these snippets to Visual Studio Code, you can do that, and I highly recommend it. So let's continue. And what our class is called is it's called to do. So all of this, technically, you do not need to care about this syntax over here. All we care about is what happens within this to do right here. This to do is basically what we will have right over here. And just like we can create normal parameters or normal name parameters or optional parameters, Freeze supports all of those. But in this instance, we will just create our named parameters. So I'm just going to paste these in. And what you will see is that we have a string description, a string ID, and a bool completed. And the first two parameters are marked as required, meaning we need to pass them in. And then the bottom one, completed, has a default value of false. And this is Freeze's way of just defining a default value. At the bottom, you can see normal Dart classes, we just say that it equals false, but with Freeze, we use this default and then we pass in the value. For example, if we wanted to give a default ID, then we would just pass in a string value over here and spell it correctly. A thing to note is that for Freeze to actually work, we will need to import a class, and that class is freezed annotation. So this one, freezed annotation / freezed annotation ... And that got rid of these warnings over here. So I'm just going to remove this example. And the next thing that we need to do for Freeze to actually work is to specify that this is a part file. So we need to say that this is part of to-do.freeze ... And this pattern over here is the name of the file, and then we just add .freezed after the name of the file, and then we say .dart. And this name will be generated, or this file will be generated, and then this to-do .dart is part of this generated file. So now the question is, how do we actually generate this? And for that is where build runner comes in. And to do that, you need to run the following command. So flutter pub run build runner build, and then the delete conflicting outputs is a safety measure, or maybe not safety measure, but I highly recommend that you always do this, just because it avoids a lot of potential problems that you could run into when using build runner. But for the sake of arguments, or for the sake of an example, I'm just going to remove the delete conflicting outputs. Technically, all you need is this. So what this does is it takes a look at the files that actually require to be built. And if we run this, that should work, hopefully, and it will generate the to-do.freeze.dart file. So this is where it becomes a little bit annoying, because you actually sometimes need to wait a little bit for it to generate. And if there are a lot of files in your project, it can become a little bit slow. So as you can see, we have our to-do.freeze.dart that's generated. And now if we go back to to-do.dart, you can see that we have no warnings. And now we have our freezed data class ready to be used. One thing that's still missing in this to-do class that we had at the bottom was this condition over here, where if the ID is equal to null, we do this null check, then we generate a new UUID. So we would like to add this over here. And I'm actually not sure if there's a cleaner way or a better way to do this, but what I normally do is I just create a factory on this class. So I'm just going to paste that in, and that factory is a create method on the to-do class. And then you just pass in the description. So what this factory assumes is that it's an entirely new to-do that you want to create. This isn't used to edit or to change one field, it's to create an entirely new one. So this will generate a new UUID, it will give a description, and it will set the default value to be false. Note that this is just a normal factory. This doesn't generate anything on Freeze's side, it's just a factory on this class that we have. The stuff that actually does the code generation are these underscore dollars and this underscore equal over here. That is what freezed recognizes as stuff that needs to be generated. So now that we have this, in our to-do.state, there's a couple of places that we'll actually need to fix a couple of things. So let's jump to the first error that we see. And this first error is giving an error because this description wasn't a named parameter in the previous model, but now it is. However, this is where we actually create a to-do. This is add method creates a to-do. So all we want to do in this instance is call that create factory that we made. So this will create a new to-do. Okay, so the second error is this particular one. We will actually need to say that this is a named one. So we'll just give name description. However, here we can actually use the copy with feature that is automatically generated on freezed. So in this method, it's the toggle method. So this toggles a method to be completed or to not be completed. So the only field that is actually changing is this completed over here. So instead of creating this entire new to-do and then passing each of these fields manually, we are just going to use the copy with that's automatically generated on our to-do class. So in this instance, what we want to do is return the current to-do, so this to-do that we get over here, and then we want to say that we will say copy with, and the field that we want to change is the completed field, and this will be the opposite of the current value. And that's it. So now it copies the description and the ID automatically, and it only changes this one field. So that is the first benefit that we get, a little bit cleaner code, and this becomes extremely useful when you have a lot of fields in your class, and even more useful when those classes reference other classes. So for example, in this to-do, let's say we had another freeze data class called test, and here we actually made use of test. Then it will also copy that entire class with all of its fields automatically for you. So you don't need to worry about any of that, and it makes life a lot simpler. Going back to to-do.state, there's one more thing we need to fix, and it's the same problem. This time we are changing the description. So I'm just gonna remove this and then say to-do.copy with description and pass in the new description. Okay, and then we have an error over here. So in our fake to-do repository, and here it is the same thing. We are creating these sample to-dos. So just calling that create factory. And I believe these are similar. We just need to say to-do.create. This one we are changing the description. And again, this code is not really important. This is just the concepts. I'm just trying to show you how you can use these freeze data classes in an actual application, or a demo application, I should say. Okay, so now we took our old application that used a normal model, to-do model, and now we're using freezed. And we saw the first benefit that we got with the copy with. We're still going to explore two other benefits that we get. One of them has to do with creating JSON classes, and the other is comparing two different classes that are technically the same. So what do I mean by that? And for this one, we're actually not going to run the code. You're just going to have to trust me that it works, or you can always run this for yourself and do a test. It's probably best to actually run this for yourself and to actually verify that this works. For argument's sake, I'm just going to uncomment this, and I'm going to call this to do old. And then let's do an example. So we will call this example 1. We will create a new to do old, and we will call it to do old, and to do old, and the description is example 1. And then we're just going to copy paste this one and create another one, and just going to call this to do old the second, or 2. And to note here is that these two are similar for us reading this as English, or they appear to be similar, passes in the same description, both get set equal to false as the default value. However, the ID will be different. So in this particular example, we will actually make this ID 1, okay? And we will do the exact same for this. We will say ID 1. So now, based on this data, we can say that these two are the same. To do all this the same as to do all 2. However, in Dart, if we were to do the following, so print to do old equals to do all 2. If we do this equals comparison over here, then we will actually see that this is not true. Dart will actually print false. So the value that it will return here is actually false. And the reason for that is because Dart, by default, compares the instances that are created. So for example, here we are creating a new instance on to do old, and now we're creating another one. These two instances are not the same, and then not pointing to the same place in memory. So as a result, Dart actually sees these two as not being equal to each other. It's not the same instance. If we were to say is to do old equal to do old, this is true. It's the same instance. And this is actually something that we want to test fairly frequently in normal coding practice. And it's definitely something that is useful when using Riverpod. The first example of where something like this could be useful, where we'd actually want it to return true instead of false for a comparison like that, is when using families. So Provider has something that is called families. And in a family, we specify the value that gets returned. So let's say it's a string value, and let's say we pass in an int value. And here we get the sum int, and here we just return this value. So let's just import Riverpod. So for a family to work, when we call test, we would say test, and we'd need to give this int value, okay? And a family creates a new provider based on the value that is passed in. So test 13 gives a different provider to test 12, gives a different provider to test 11. You get the idea. But when we say to do old, Freeze doesn't have a way of knowing that these two similar ones, so test whatever the to do old is, so to do old this, it has no way of knowing that to do old and to do old 2 are actually the exact same thing. And this is something that we would want in certain situations, and in future videos we will go into more detail regarding that. So this is where the freezed data classes come in handy, and that is because if we generate our to-do example, or generate if we create an instance of that, and the exact same thing, I'm just gonna copy this over, and this will require a description, and then copy paste this. Then in this particular instance, when we do a print or when we do a check to see if to do equals to do 2, this will actually return true, because here a deep comparison is being performed to make sure that the description matches each other, that the ID matches each other, and that the completed state matches each other. So this completes it over here. And now if we were to create a family based off of this, that would actually be the same two things. Different instances, yes, but when we do a comparison, they actually make sure that the fields on them match exactly. If we were to say that this is ID 2, then this comparison will no longer be true, and we will get false. Cool, so in this app, we aren't actually using this at all. So this was just an example to show you. So let's remove all of that. And next up, we will talk about creating the Json classes, or automatically passing Json to an object. And to get started with that, we will need to go back to pubsec.yaml, and we will need to add Json serializable. And Json serializable is a package that you can use on its own. It's not dependent on Freeze. Freeze is not dependent on Json serializable. Freeze just makes use of Json serializable to use all of the nice things that it has to create classes from JSON objects. And with Freeze, it's very simple to actually incorporate this JSON conversion. I'm recording the upcoming section again because I forgot a very important detail, and as a result I will need to redo this part of the video. So to continue where we left off, what we want to do is we want a way to easily generate our to-do class from JSON. And that is really simple to do with freezed and JSON serializable. And all we need to do is add one extra factory method to our class. And that factory is the following. It's to-do.fromJSON. Then we pass in the JSON, which is of type map string dynamic. And then this is just freezed syntax to do the generation. For every single class where you want to have a from JSON, or where you would like to generate JSON as well, this is the syntax that you will use. The only changing bit is the name of the class. So this to do here and this to do here. So you can create a snippet out of this as well to quickly generate this factory. Now the very important part is that you will also need to include an additional part file. So this part file will be the todo.g.dart file, and that is the part file that will be generated for JSON serializable. So now that we have all of this, we can just do the build runner again. But this time, instead of showing you the build runner, I want to show you the watch instead. So yeah, just as a side note, if you didn't know, if you press Ctrl R in a terminal, then you can do a search. So I normally just search for build, and then it brings up my build runner. So instead of saying build, we will say watch. And what watch does is it listens to changes in your file. And then every time it detects a change, it will automatically run. So I normally tend to use watch when I'm actively working on these models and when I want it to continuously generate the updates as I make them. So as an example, let's quickly comment this out, these new things that we added, and save the file and run watch. So this will build as normal. So now I can see it has finished and it succeeded. And now if we were to make updates to the file, so let's bring this back. And as soon as we save the file, then build runner will automatically re-execute. And as you can see, it is finished. And this time it also generated this todo.g.dart file. So this part file that we specified here. And you will note that we still get this error. The editor is not picking up that this file exists. And this may be a problem for you, or maybe it's just a problem that I experience. But yeah, in my experience, sometimes Visual Studio Code doesn't automatically pick up these generated files, or it doesn't pick up that the files have changed. So all you need to do is just open the file. So just tap on todo.g.dart and then it will register those changes. Or you can do the following. You can just bring up your command palette with Ctrl-Shift-P and then type in reload. And then there's an option to reload the window, and that will reload all of the files. But that's a little bit more intensive. So now that we've generated the functions that will allow us to convert our class to and from JSON, now we can actually start using it and implementing it in this app. So we will go to the fake to-do repository. And here where we have the sample to-dos, I'm going to remove this. And instead of using this, we will now use this mock JSON object over here. So this is actually just a list of string, and then each of these strings has a JSON object in it. So as you can see, we have JSON over here. And this is supposed to be the representation of one of our to-do models. So you can pretend that this is essentially what you might get back from a server response. So if you make a request to the server to return all of the to-dos, then this could be the response from the server. Though it wouldn't be a list of strings, it would be a list of JSONs. But anyway, let's continue. So the first thing that we need to do is we have this mock to-do storage list of type to-do. And in the previous version, we just mapped the to-dos that we had, that list of to-dos, into the new one. So if you're not familiar with this syntax, this is creating a new list. We are unpacking this specific list into this new list. But now the thing that we're unpacking is a string and we're trying to unpack it into a list of to-dos. So you'll see the error is that, well, the first error is that sample to-dos doesn't exist anymore. So let's bring in sample to-dos or sample JSON to-dos. You'll see that it can't unpack a string into a to-do. Okay, so the thing that we need to do is we need to convert this JSON to an actual to-do. So for that, we will call map, and this will give us the to-do. And we can actually call this to-do JSON maybe, but let's just call it to-do. And then make this a block body. And then for the return, what we will do is we will call our to-do model, and we will use this from JSON method, or this from JSON factory. And now we need to pass this JSON. And as this is currently a string, we will need to use the JSON decode, and this comes from the Dart convert library. So just import that, and then we can pass in that string. So we'll pass in the to-do string. So this is actually perfectly fine. This is working, but it's currently saying that the argument type dynamic can't be assigned to the parameter type map string dynamic. And that is because in the analysis options, I have implicit cast set to false. If we were to set this to true, which is the default, then that warning will go away, as you can see. However, it is recommended that the implicit casts are actually set to false. It's better to be explicit about what you want to cast to a certain object, and that is a topic on its own. But yeah, to cast something, all you do is you just cast it as the thing that you want it to be, as the type that you want it to be. So this will be a map of string dynamic. And there we go. So now we're creating a to-do model from this JSON that we have over here. And the cool thing to note is that if we have this to-do, so let's call this to-do converted. At the bottom here, if we call toJSON on that object, you can see that we can generate the JSON from the to-do model as well. So if we needed to send JSON to the server, for example, let's say you update the to-do and you need to send that updated JSON to the server, all you do is call toJSON on this model, send it through your HTTP request or whatever, and there you go. So for example, that might look something like http://post and then the to-do.toJSON. And then there you go. You don't have to code any of those complicated JSON serializing and mapping the model to JSON. It is handled for you. And no matter how big your model grows, it will just magically do it for you, as long as you regenerate the file. Cool, but this was just an example, so I'm just going to remove this. And now we can move to the final part of this video, and that is exploring how to use the unions within Freezed. And that is honestly the best part about Freezed, and the thing that I literally cannot live without. In the previous videos, we took a look at using async value, and if we quickly do a search here for .when, you'll remember that with an async value, we can access .when and .map and maybe when and all of those good things, and it gives us access to the different state conditions on a union class. So for the example, on the async value, we can have a data state or a loading state or an error state. And in that video, we also saw that async value is generated using Freezed. So what I want to show you next is how you can actually generate your own async values. And it doesn't need to be called async value, it can be called whatever. And it will allow you to add more of these types of conditions. So technically anywhere in an application where you want to use an if statement, it kind of means that maybe you should consider using a union instead. Because the main advantage of using these unions is that you are forced to handle all of these conditions. When you call .when, you have to handle data, you have to handle loading, and you have to handle error. And it's also a very nice way to pass your state around in your application. So let's actually just jump into how we can generate a union class in Freezed. So what we want to do is basically create our own async value that is customized just for our to-dos. So it's kind of a redundant example because we have async value, but I do think it will get the points across. So to begin, we want to create the skeleton. So I have this snippet that you can get from GitHub, and we'll call this class to-dos. And then you can see that we have these constant factories, and we are calling dots, and then we can give the name. So the name of the factory. So the first one will be the data state. And then we need to give it the class an actual name. So this will be the to-dos data. And within this, we can pass in parameters. So the value that we get in this data will be a list of to-do, and we will call it to-dos. So that is our first condition, the data. And then we also want two more. We want loading, and we want error. And important, we will need to make sure that these are also the same. So this needs to be unique. It can be called whatever, but it's obviously better to name it concisely. So now we have our three different classes. We have to-dos loading, or to-dos data, loading, and error. And these can be private as well. But for this example, we will make them public. And in the data, we want to pass in a list of to-dos. Loading, we want nothing. And in error, we want a object that we will call error. And we want to pass in a stack trace. And we will call this st. And there we go. This is the union class that we made. And all we need to do is just call build on this. So I'm just going to do a search for build. And we will actually not do watch. Okay, and perfect. Let's just tap on to-do.freeze. And if we go back, no errors. And now I can use this to-dos with the data loading and error. And in this example, again, this is kind of redundant. What I want to do is, instead of returning this async value with list of to-dos, let's now return our custom to-dos, okay? And this will actually not cause an error in our UI because it still has the same functionality. We're just recreating async value. But what we will need to do is map our current to-do state, which is an async value list of to-dos, to this to-dos. So to do that, we're just gonna comment this for now. We will return the to-dos state, and we will call when, not when data, we want to call when. And for these conditions, we will return different to-do states. For the data, we will get access to our to-dos, and here we want to return to-dos.data, and then we will pass in our to-dos. Then for loading, we don't get anything. This time we will just return to-dos.loading. And then finally, for the error condition, we get access to the error and we get access to the stack trace, and we will just return to-dos.error, and then we can pass in the error and the stack trace. And there we go. If we save it and format it nicely, now we are mapping our async value to this custom to-dos async value that we made. And this particular one can actually be a constant because it's not receiving any parameters. And finally, we can remove this. So perfect. Now we created this custom one. And as I said, it's kind of a redundant example. But the point is that now we have the option to add additional states to this to-dos class, whatever that may be. Maybe it's like a to-dos not authenticated, or to-dos with additional data. Or maybe you can forget all about this data loading and error state. And instead of doing all of this, we can maybe do a completely different kind of union. So let's call this to-dos 2. This one can maybe be one where we are marking whether they are completed or not. So this can be uncompleted, and I cannot spell that. And the next one can, for example, be completed. And then you can use these unions with map and when and maybe map to do different things dependent on whether to do is completed or not. So instead of checking to see if that bool is set to true, you can just do map to easily do the same. So if it's only 2 conditions like this, then a bool would probably be better. But especially when you have multiple different conditions in your app, then these unions become very nice. Or if it's in a situation where you want to ensure that you handle those conditions, because it might happen that you forget to check that a to-do is completed before doing some operation in your application, where something like this ensures that for you to actually access whatever state is here, you would need to be in the to-do's completed condition, if that makes sense. To continue with all of this, let's actually explore how we can clean up our current exception mechanism to make use of unions in a little bit more intelligent way. So in this repositories, I'm just going to add a new file. I'm going to call this exceptions.dart, and I'm just going to paste in a union. So this is called to-do failure, and then we have multiple fail conditions: retrieve failure, add failure, remove failure, edit failure. So these are different fail conditions that happen when you try to manipulate the to-dos. And we will touch more on this now. Let's just quickly build this. Okay, great, it's finished, and we have our exceptions freezed and no errors in exceptions.dart. Now what we want to do is, in our fake to-do repository, we currently have this to-do exception class that implements exception. So I'm just going to remove this, and that is because we will no longer be using it. However, we will be using a similar one. So at the bottom of this exceptions.dart class, I have the exact same one. The only difference is that instead of passing in a failure message, like a string failure message, which was the previous one, this one passes in a to-do failure, which is this union over here. So in the fake to-do repository, what we want to do is, instead of passing the old one where we have to give these descriptions, we want to pass in a failure condition. So first off, we will just need to import exceptions.dart, and this is the to-dos could not be retrieved. So we will say to-do failure. This is a retrieve failure. And we also need to specify that this is a named parameter. So the failure that we are giving is retrieve failure, and this can no longer be a constant. However, the failure can be. So this is just to illustrate. So now we are saying, instead of passing in a message, we are actually passing in this class, this retrieve failure class, that we can more optimally use in our UI to map these different failure conditions, instead of just showing a text message. And we will get to that in a moment. For now, I'm just going to continue doing the same for all of these. So you don't need to watch me do this. I'm just going to quickly speed through that. Okay, so I'm done. I mapped all of those messages to the correct fail condition. And now in to-do.state, I think we just need to import the exceptions class that we made. And same for this one, we'll need to import to-do exception. And what we're doing in this example is, in the to-do screen, we used to just display the string error message. But now the exception that we are getting back is that failure. So on these states, we get access to this failure. And this failure we can now call map on, and map will give us access to all of these different conditions. And we can do when and all of that nice things. However, for this example, we still want to show that message, the snack bar that shows the description of the failure. That's a nice thing that Freezed actually does for us with this union class, is that if a particular field is shared between all of the different unions, then you can still use it as normal. So we can still call failure.description. So what do I mean by that? In our exceptions class, you can see that each one of these different types, or each one of these different conditions, has the same string description field. So each one of these. So that is why we can still use or still do this. We can directly call the description field. However, if one of these were to not have that, then we will no longer be able to call description. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But as an alternative to doing it like this, something else that you can do is just creates a custom message from the current state of the failure. So for example, you can paste in this value over here. Instead of using the description, you can say .map on the failure, and then depending on the condition that you have, so let's format this. So depending on the states, you can just return your own unique message. So as an example, for this particular one, we will say that could not retrieve. That is something that you can do. But the very nice thing is that this allows you to do more things. So instead of just returning a message, you can, for example, say that if there's a retrieve failure, then maybe you will log an error message somewhere, or maybe you will show a different kind of error message. You don't just want to show a text message. Maybe you want the user to be navigated to a certain part of the app, or maybe one of these failures is not authenticated. And if it's not authenticated, then you want to make sure that the user is taken back to the sign up screen or the login screen. These are just examples of how you can use freezed and unions. As I say, I use them daily. Basically every single time where I want to use an if, I instead just use unions. Not always, but especially once you become more comfortable with them and you see the advantage of them, especially when you want to refactor your application, then you'll probably just start using them more and more. Because again, the nice thing here is that the moment you add another exception, so here, whatever this exception can be, if you add something here, the moment you do that, then your code analysis will complain saying that, hey, you have a map here, you are not handling that new condition that you made. And yeah, that is me rambling about freezed. In future videos, I'll probably be using freezed more practically and won't go into as great detail about how to use freezed and instead just use it. So if you still struggle with the whole concept of this, I suggest playing around with it yourself. It does take a little bit of getting used to, or stay tuned and see some more practical examples of how I use it. There's a lot of other small details and stuff that freeze does that is actually extremely nice and that you may find useful as well. So I definitely suggest reading the freeze documentation or just browsing the index and seeing what exactly it can do. But yeah, that is that for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.